So my cousin and I, along with her 8-year-old sister, were driving to my place from their mother's house after spending 2 nights there for the Super Bowl and more. It was a big family event, and even though half of us don't watch football, all the relatives in the family do. Now I'll admit that when I'm driving, I worry about idiots on the road. Not completely throwing someone off the highway is heated. Just heated. We hadn't been on the road that long until we saw a truck a little further on. This dude was also driving unbearably slow in the fast lane. Also, I should mention that it was around 12 a.m. and very few people were driving. So I put my right indicator on trying to pass this guy and continue on my way. But as soon as I pull into the next lane to pass, the guy in front does the same and slams on the brakes. I remember hearing my cousin's exclamation and being so shocked and scared that I swerved into the left lane while honking my horn and giving the person the middle finger. Not even 10 seconds passed. My cousin behind me says that a person is coming towards us very fast. The same dude who was driving very slowly before now almost crashed into the back of my car. He honks his horn, swerves his truck to the far left, and tries to force me into the upcoming ditch, and we all scream in the car, while my cousin in the passenger seat yells at me to take the next exit. The man is still following us, honking his horn and tailing me. At this point, I was already hitting 90 with the light ahead, but I didn't want to slow down while this lunatic was behind me. We were speeding up to a red light, and I swerved into the right lane, hitting the brakes. At this point, my 10-year-old cousin is crying behind me, and honestly, I felt like I was going to cry too. The man I could see clearly now looked like he hadn't showered in days. He also had something in his left hand, but I couldn't see what it was. I was frozen with fear, as if frozen, and could not move. It's never happened to me either, and all those horror movies I've seen where the victims just don't move make a lot more sense now. Anyway, he was already getting out of the car and walking right up to me with his head against my window. The guy saw my cousin crying in the back and just yelled through the glass, "You're lucky you have a baby with you. If she wasn't behind you, both bitches would be dead for trying to pull this crap on me." The light turns green, and the guy walks back to his truck with what I can now see as a baseball bat, and he just drives off. We all just sat in silence, even with. Light Green and I learned a valuable lesson that night. You never know who's behind the wheel of the car, so learn to let it go if someone annoys you on the road. No hooting and middle fingers are worth it, and I guess my only excuse for last night was just being tired, and I just wanted to get home to get up early to take my cousin to work, her car to the store, and take my cousin to school. We were really lucky that night, and I hope it never happens again. So, I'm in high school, my last year, and we actually had the opportunity to go to France on a trip. This was our assessment of the Duke of Edinburgh. A group of kids my age, we all set up tents the first day. We thought it would be better to line them up as well, and we have a hedge by our openings and a few vacant lots opposite. A metal fence too, black with straight posts. So beyond that was a patch or two of long, waist-high grass, and then a mountain with an old war memorial on top. But that day, we went up to the memorial and it was really cool. There is a shop and several rooms full of old guns and clothing, and then an old fort that is used on the shoreline. I don't remember the exact location, but if I do, I'll try to let you guys know. So, it was already late, and our assessor invited us to his camper for tea. I remember that there was also hot chocolate. We went back to our tents, got comfortable, chatted while the tent was open, and then we heard this noise, and I've never heard anything like a fox screaming, but deeper and bassier. We dismissed it as a fox and continued chatting, and the next minute, we heard it again, closer this time. Then the other guy in my tent pokes his head out and whispers loudly, telling us to search faster. And I can only describe what I saw that day as horrifying, and it honestly makes me feel so weird just thinking about it. And I don't know why. Just a nagging feeling like I know it was bad or something. Anyway, it looked like a man, small, crouched on all fours, but it was fast. He ran through the fence and apparently squeezed through the cracks, but it looked like he just swam through the middle. I don't know, but he started sniffing around or something, staying about 40 feet away from the fence, and then he came back over the fence, and you could see him rustling through the long grass as he ran back toward the mountain on. Then we heard the noise again, but this time it was different. This time it was louder, and it literally sounded like a man screaming. but it was much further away. We honestly didn't know what to think and didn't panic, which was amazing, and everyone just froze in shock. The next day, we returned to the memorial, and as we walked, for some reason, as we were walking to the entrance, a French officer in uniform with a bulletproof vest and cap approaches us. He was armed, with a small pistol tucked into a holster on his belt. I know a gun when I see one, and he said we had to leave, that we weren't allowed in, and that was it. It was very strange, but that was pretty much all that happened. We continued our trip and I forgot about it, but remembering everything, it's just amazing. So to start this off, I need to give you guys a little background. My husband and I lived in a big city in a small, tiny house that was about 500 square feet. We were planning a wedding and soon to have a family, so we couldn't stay there anymore, and neither could I, but he was fine with that. But anyway, we've had dreams of moving to the country, and we found such an amazing deal on 320 acres that we just had to go and check it out. We emailed the realtor, and she said the woman who lives there isn't quite ready to show the house yet. She really didn't want to sell, so she didn't know when she would be able to show it. We asked if we could come and look at the land, and the house would be fine as long as we didn't build our dream house away from the highway anyway. We drive excited as always, stop and get out of the truck. All you could hear were the birds and the wind, and it was so peaceful and quiet compared to the city life. We knew right away that this would be our home. The realtor came, but the owner of the house was not there, so she showed the house. It was 1,300 square feet, so it honestly felt like a mansion, and the lady who owned it was in her 80s and lived on the property alone. Her children actually wanted her to move closer to them, afraid that something might happen to her, and she always went out to the fields on her quad bike, which was not reliable at all, or in some beat-up old van. Anyway, in her house there were pictures of just saints everywhere. She was Haitian, and I got a voodoo vibe, but not in a negative way at all. So we go explore the outbuildings, and one of them has this chair, a ton of burnt candles, and some knives. Again, more of a voodoo vibe, but not a negative one. It's a religion, and I'm not one to judge what people believe and all that. But we ended up meeting this woman, and she took us on her ATV to see the land. He stopped several times. She was very cheerful and upbeat, and seemed to like my husband and me. We made an offer and actually got the house. We had a bunch of friends help us move in November 2016, and I burned sage in the house because it's just what I do, and I've never had any bad vibes, but I just did it to clear it from our things. I also had a friend with me at the time, and she did say she saw a shadow moving, so she also went to the house with sage to be safe. We know someone died on the property, apparently cutting down trees, so I wanted to be safe too. That evening, another friend of mine also felt the eerie atmosphere. They stayed in a bedroom on the main level, and she said it felt like someone was watching all night. The main level, in the original house, has a bedroom, kitchen, living room, and large pantry. On the main level was an annex that had a dish pit, aka sink and cabinets, but not enough space for a table. It also had a bathroom and its own small cellar. The original basement looks like something out of a dungeon with just giant boulders, and it was completely unfinished. The posts holding up the beams are trees, not 4x4s, and it's very rustic, and honestly I love it. But I guess it can give off some weird vibes. I'm no stranger to the paranormal, having grown up in a haunted house, but that's another long story. But my husband has always been a big skeptic. Although the battered old barn falling apart has always scared me, I just never liked it, and always avoided it. Half the roof had caved in anyway, and to be honest, it looked a bit like a scene from a horror movie, and even my husband was a little scared. He felt that when he repaired something there, something would always pop out. Anyway, now for the paranormal bits. So I can't remember when it started, as it just happened in the few years we lived there. But it all seemed to start when I walked into the living room and past the basement stairs. I saw a black dog, almost shaped like a pit bull, sitting at the bottom of the stairs with just red eyes. I did a double take, and as soon as I looked back, he was gone. I went down to the basement thinking it was our big dog, a Mastiff Rottweiler Shepherd Lab cross. But he wasn't there, and he was in the dish basket. So, I say my husband and I just brush it off. I have to admit, I felt a little embarrassed about it, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. At the next event, I actually miscarried. I don't know how long after that, maybe a few months, I think. So I'm actually in a pretty dark place. We also had an argument with a close friend that ended up being pretty messy, and a lot of negative family drama with the in-laws. The father-in-law is very abusive and manipulative and all that good stuff. Anyway, in a few months, my husband has to go to work overnight in another province. The first night I was home, it was very creepy. I just felt so out of sorts all night, and I was very thankful that he was only gone for one night. I just felt like I wasn't alone, and my dogs were a bit on edge too, and it was really windy and stormy outside, and it was the perfect scene for a horror movie. So I just went to bed early and slept. So go on again, and I'm pregnant again. Our boy was growing wonderfully. Our 2 old dogs, Japanese chins, had some crazy dental work, and they were not happy campers. So they stayed up all night, and my pregnant woman was tired and cranky. So I took my Yorkie to sleep on the main guest bed, and she was quite restless. And she kept looking in the corner of the room, and then moved to different parts of the bed, trying to get comfortable. Always sit and look in the corner. This is the bedroom that my friend was very negative about. So my Yorkie Poo started growling in the corner of the room. So we got out of there pretty quickly, and I had a sleepless night without the dogs. It was very dark, and nothing could be seen in the room. And then in June, we had a music festival on our territory. It's been fun, and it's all about that in the future. My sweet boy decided to be a breech baby and kept getting on my nerves to the point where I couldn't walk. So I went on maternity leave early at 36 weeks at the end of July 2018. So I'm home now, very beautiful all day. Home felt very different than just being home in the evenings and weekends. It felt like there was a weight. And I also couldn't go into the basement when it was dark, only during the day, and I just felt like something bad would happen if I did. I constantly felt like I was being watched too. When the little dogs were in our bedroom with the Yorkie Poo, they barked and growled at anyone who came up the stairs, which was completely new behavior for them. And that's when I started to get the feeling that I was being followed up the stairs. Anyway, a boy was born, and he's a night owl, so I'm sleeping a lot at night, which isn't normal for me. Our top floor is 3/4, so where the walls are, there's storage space because of the angle of the roof and everything. And in the boy's bedroom, there is an opening without a door. Actually, I feed him in this room so as not to disturb my husband, because he is still at work at the moment. And it always seems that something is watching and just waiting. I always avoided looking at it because I felt like if I did, I'd see glowing eyes or something worse. Even just walking down the hall between bedrooms is really uncomfortable during those night feedings. And it was at this point that I ended up seeing this shadow following me, which was really creepy, and it just defied all science. I always tried to debunk what I saw so I wouldn't drive myself crazy. But these shadows, they were also very large and high from the ceiling. Sometimes 10 feet, and were disproportionately large. I would like to recreate the shadows with my steps, but it never worked out. As for the feelings, I always tried to make myself believe that it was in my head, just an overactive imagination, but sometimes the knocking came from the basement, especially when the internet was down and our modem and router were actually in the basement. And it was always terrible because I had to work up a lot of nerve to go and fix the internet, because it was my lifeline without a cape. At one point, we actually moved the guest bed into the basement, and I was going to sleep there one night to catch up, and my husband was going to feed the baby boy at night. So I settled in the basement and was nice and cozy and excited for a good night's sleep. I turn off the light, and there's that green light on the ceiling. It dims and fades slightly, but not in the usual way. So I think it must be channel reflection or something. I turn on the light, and where the green light was, there is solid wood, and also no green light to cause reflection. I looked around for quite some time to find an explanation for this light, but there was simply no reason for it to appear. And at that point, I just somehow got out and walked into our travel trailer on a cold fall night. We had another festival in September and ended up talking to someone who was there in June. So they asked me about our other big black dog, and I say there is only one. And they are absolutely serious about seeing this big dog-like pit bull in the field at both festivals. and it made me feel like I wasn't crazy and that I had actually seen something, and reassured me that what I was going through was real. But then it made me realize that I'm not crazy and that this is really happening, and it was very scary. I am very isolated when my husband is at work, and our nearest neighbor is a mile away, and our whole family lives an hour away. So I'm a little scared of everything that's going on, and I'm talking to local friends and city friends, and at some point I actually come into contact with a medium. She made me send her a picture of the house and said the ground is bad, the house is bad, the dog must be a demon, and she offered to come and help me salt the house for gas money. In fact, she never charged me for anything and never told me why the land was bad. And to this day, I still wonder. I also ended up getting a local church group to come and pray through the house, but nothing really worked. But they told me some crazy stories about other houses they blessed, so there must have been a lot of ghosts in the area or something. Terrified, I run back to my grandparents as fast as I can, and as soon as I get there, my grandma is mad at me for being outside. I tried to explain to her how everyone at the party disappeared and she had no idea what I was talking about. But there was a party. She told me that we were staying at her house so that my parents could arrange a date, and I even asked Casey and her sister about it the next day, and they had no idea what I was talking about. Casey says her birthday isn't actually for a few weeks. To this day, my family says I must have been sleepwalking and dreaming it all, but I can't agree with that. I mean, it felt real. I remember it all too clearly. It couldn't be just a dream. So I went to a party that never really happened. This is an experience I had 2 months ago when I was at my grandmother's. I was outside near a couple of metal bins to sort of throw out my trash. Containers are placed around a tall hedge, and it's really dark outside. Now the hedge has made the space around the containers even darker than the surroundings. The containers are also placed in such a way that there isn't a lot of space between them, so it's a little hard to explain. But it was crowded, and it was hard to see the entire space at a certain point, even with the lighting. Because of the darkness, I turn on the phone torch and start throwing the trash in the bin. One of the containers that holds the plastic was completely full, so I tried to fit as much as I could into it, but it got a bit tricky. In fact, because it was full, the lid from the plastic container fell to the ground and rolled to the edge of the container. I bent down to pick it up, and then I thought I heard what I can only describe as an animal low growl or hiss. The sound was so quiet that at first I thought I had imagined it. I shone my torch around the corner of the container, expecting to see an animal like a raccoon or stray cat. However, there was absolutely nothing. Not a pair of reflective eyes or anything like that. Eventually, I shook off the feeling and continued to load the trash into the dumpster. I think this went on for another half-minute until I heard what I can only describe as an animal scream coming from somewhere very close to me. This sound filled me with such horror that with trembling hands, I simply gathered my things and left without looking back. On my way back, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped and listened, the sound also slowed down and stopped. However, every time I stopped walking, it would last for a good half-second, and would only resume when I started walking again. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anyone or anything there. Since then, I've been Googling anything that might be similar to what I heard, and so far I haven't found anything similar. It sounded like an animal, but not like an animal I had heard of before. It didn't sound like a normal cat or dog or anything, and looking back, I don't know why I had such an emotional reaction to the experience. The level of fear he instilled in me was something I had never experienced before, and the encounter left me shaking for hours. This is definitely one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. But what really confuses me is that I just didn't see anything. The meeting could be explained by some animal, but when I tried to look, there was nothing. Also, the stepping phenomenon is something I've experienced before when walking to the store, and it only seems to happen around a very specific stretch of road very close to these bins. To this day, I don't know what I heard that day, but it shook me for a long time. A few years ago, one of my best friends and business partners was and still is a single parent. His ex-wife had been in a mental institution for years, and he had sole custody of his two children, a 10-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl. So, a friend of mine had to travel to New York to supervise the multimedia installations at the Ford display. I went back to the office with the programmers during the day and stayed with the kids every evening. Their home was a new 2-story rental in the woods in Texas, and the development was built in a heavily wooded area north of Houston. Strange things started happening the first night I was there too. I was watching TV with the kids and the lights in the den just kept going out. The light switch was also on the other side of the room. I walked over and the switch was off. At first I thought it was a switch problem or something. Or was there another switch? But if there was another switch, who turned it off? However, I flipped the switch back on, and the light came back on, and I went back to sit down. However, the light went out again, and I went back to find that the switch had been flipped back to the off position, which actually bothered me a bit. It also went on for a while, and I asked the kids if this had happened before, and they told me every now and then the light just went off. So now I'm trying to act nonchalant in front of the kids, and all of a sudden there's a loud bang in the attic. We went upstairs and opened the attic door to check, and there was nothing there. It was completely empty, and there was no explanation for what was making the loud noise. I think there must be someone else in the house at this point. I mean, their mother used to show up at their old house unexpectedly, but she was in jail at the time and apparently didn't even have their address. However, everything quieted down, and finally it was time to go to bed. I let the family dog into the lab, checked all the doors and made sure they were all locked, then went up to the guest room that was between the kids' bedrooms. I had just turned off the bedside lamp and was lying down when I saw the silhouette of a boy crouched between the cable box or VCR light at the other end of the room and me. At first, I thought the sun was going to try to scare me, so I turned on the night lamp and said, "Hello," but there was no one there. And then a loud roar was heard again in the attic. This woke up the children too, and now they were very frightened. And then we heard a door slam downstairs. I told them it was a new house and there was noise, and I also told them I was going to sleep on the couch in the hallway, and I went around again and we all went back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the kids and the dog were sleeping on the floor next to my bed, and I still have more than 4 nights. In Expatriate, Montana, a village-sized town of about 500 people, there is a large ranch house with a main floor, an attic converted into a bathroom, and a truly ancient basement. It is located just before the Mill Creek Bridge that crosses the Yellowstone River and is very large with acres of land. So my grandparents raised my dad there, and her sister, Aunt Elle, and their half-sister. It was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and because it was a huge property with a barn, a detached garage, several chicken coops, and fields for livestock or crops, and naturally several ranch hands had died on the property before they settled down. To give you an idea of what the house looks like, there is a large main floor consisting of 2 bathrooms, 4 bedrooms, a laundry room, and a huge kitchen. Up the stairs, which went along the long corridor from the living room, led to only one room. I think it used to be a regular loft. But when my dad grew up there, it had already been converted into a bedroom, which was my Aunt Elle's bedroom. I used to talk to Aunt Elle about her bad experiences in the house, most happening in her lonely attic, as she called it. She told me that she often suffered from terrible night terrors, and even as a teenager refused to sleep there, instead sleeping on the mattress in the living room with my grandmother. She also once described to me one of her night terrors, and in her dreams she was pinned to a bed in the attic, unable to move, surrounded by many humanoid figures in red robes. I was so happy that I had this last experience with her, but just saddened and horrified. I mean, she was so young, barely older than me. Soon she turned 17, and it was a very sad time for our city. The good and bad news is that they caught the guy who did it. He confessed after several highly revealing statements, and during interrogation also confessed to killing his girlfriend, who had been missing for about 8 years, as well as his father, staging his death as a suicide by hanging. When they showed his picture on the screen and called his name, I swear I almost passed out. Because there, plain as day, on the screen looking at me, was the image of JR. Now I had no idea they even knew each other. I can't even imagine what would have happened if we had gone under the bridge that night. The Investigation Discovery Channel did a feature on this a couple of years ago, and I was shocked to see it on TV. The memories came flooding back, and I decided to write them all down. I've literally found a new outlook on life, now that I'm old enough to realize how close I could have been to being killed that night. I have a wonderful life with my husband and 3 boys that probably wouldn't have happened if things had gone differently that night. A little bit. The sheriff's office was about 20 feet away. To be honest, I really didn't think I would have this much trouble. And I mean, there were about 30 customers in an 8-hour shift, and it was on a busy night. Anyway, it was about 3:30 in the morning, and I went outside to sweep the parking lot and do a last-minute check on trash and stuff. It was time for a cigarette, and one of my headphones went off. Across the street in the sheriff's office parking lot, I saw a figure standing with his back to me. He was rocking back and forth looking down, and honestly, it looked like he was enjoying a much-needed pee or something. But against the sheriff's office, yes. The building closes at 4 p.m. and doesn't open until 6 a.m. the next day. But why? From the back of his tattered white t-shirt, I remembered that he had come in about 4 hours ago. He was crawling, and I could already tell that he had a good buzz. I didn't say anything, I just looked away from him and tried not to draw attention to myself. And it worked until the car arrived. I was still outside when they pulled up, and I saw him look at the car, then at me, and back and forth. As the customer was leaving, I took her outside, and I still had half the smoke burning, and I left the scoop outside with the squeegee. We both heard him start cursing angrily and seemed to be arguing with himself, and she looked across the road and told me to be careful. I awkwardly joked that he should be more afraid of me or something like that. The man was still there, but closer to the road, facing the parking lot of my store. Whatever he was shouting was also completely unintelligible. He was obviously very drunk and could barely stand straight while still walking away. I didn't practice with him, but I didn't take my eyes off him at that time either. I just slowly walked back into the store, and something about his face really bothered me. There was darkness in him, but his eyes were just wild. My experience working in cemeteries is that people with crazy people are the worst. I didn't like it at all, and I didn't want to be a part of it, and I still had almost 3 hours and 2 before the other staff would get there. So I instantly went to the computer and printed out a temporarily closed sign just in case he wanted trouble. I was walking around the counter on my way to the door when I saw him cross the road to my side. I had literally just barely closed the other door when he came upon our very small parking lot. My hand makes a cut on the neck, basically saying, "No, sorry, you can't come in here, we're closed." And I also shake my head back and forth, hoping to discourage him even more. It was very similar to sleep paralysis for me, but she was thrashing and screaming in her sleep, so it shouldn't have happened. Aunt Ella was also very frightened after this experience, and my grandmother bought her a small crucifix to wear as a necklace. They were somewhat religious and Catholic and attended the local church, but usually only my Aunt Elle and Grandma went. The rest of my family didn't seem to care about religion, but after wearing the crucifix, she found that the night terrors just stopped, even when she slept in a haunted room. She said that it really meant a lot, and that she was finally able to feel almost safe in her room again, and things got better. Now Aunt Elle doesn't know how, but a few years later she lost the necklace, and almost immediately her nightmares and restless nights returned. In fact, it got so bad that they apparently performed an exorcism, although that may not be the correct term, because only certain priests are licensed by the Vatican to perform actual exorcisms, I think, but I would call it the Montana Village version of exorcism. My grandmother reached out to church members for help after she became increasingly disturbed by Aunt Elle's behavior and other strange occurrences in the house and property, such as cupboards being opened, objects moving, strange noises, etc. Many members of the church came to the house, including the pastor, and some drove several hours to attend. They all stood in a circle in the living room and held hands, praying and trying to rid the house of whatever was haunting him and my family. Aunt Elle says some people have even started speaking in tongues. I personally find it hard to believe, but I love and trust my aunt, and I'd like to believe it happened. But in any case, even with sage burning, crucifixes hanging over the door, and a group of faithful Catholics holding hands and singing, these demonic spirits just wouldn't leave the house. An exorcism performed in Montana failed. There wasn't much my grandma could do, and they weren't going to be leaving the house anytime soon, so they just tried to live with it. However, shortly after the exorcism from home, my Aunt Ella remembered her old crucifix that worked for her, and soon bought another one almost identical to the first one she had been wearing. And again the ghosts and strange behavior during sleep subsided, until they eventually grew up and moved away. However, the house was kept in the family, but everyone went their separate ways, and maybe they rented it out for a while or something in the late 80s and 90s, but I'm not entirely sure. Fast forward about 15 years, right before I was born, my father, mother, and older brother, who was the only one at the time, got permission from his family to rent a house and moved to run a horse and glass etching business from home. It was also a great place to raise kids right on Yellowstone, where we had so much fun. I was born in 1998 and lived in this house for what seems like 6 years. I only have memories, I think, of 4 or 6 years old in that house. My brother was between 6 and 8 and has even better memories. My parents told us countless stories after we moved out and got older, and we all remembered how creepy it was to live there, and we all agreed that it was indeed haunted. Once I was out of the cot, I had my own bed and room, and my room was next to the kitchen, but my brother's room was very far at the other end of the house. I hated my room, so I used to play in my brother's room a lot, and the main floor was honestly massive and really stretched out like a maze, especially for a 5-year-old. My parents got a room in the attic for solitude, and my dad told me that shortly after moving in, and when I was too young to know what was going on, the night terrors started. My mom slept alone in the living room on the futon most nights at first, which wasn't unusual because my dad was a very loud snorer and she just couldn't sleep. She later admitted that she still couldn't stand the atmosphere coming from that room. He started to walk away, but he was yelling something at me as he walked. And I didn't mean he was being grumpy and yelling at me, or yelling that I was an asshole or anything. I mean he was in an angry voice and violently throwing his hands everywhere. Of course, knowing that I was on the wrong shift or the wrong job, I was very confused at the time. At that point, I decided to call the police, and it's a good thing too, because the moment I hung up on them, he came to the door again and started yanking and banging on it and backed up and bumped into it trying to ram it in. Not that it would do any good, but I made the mistake of telling him I called the police and his ass is about to turn into grass, and I say I made the mistake of telling him because once I said it, he took it down. The police never found him, and they drove the road and the surrounding area for over an hour, but found almost no one. He was also walking, so I don't see where he could have gone. He didn't hurt me and they didn't find him. I didn't file a police report or anything, and I was safe behind the thick glass doors that were locked for the rest of my shift. But the whole situation was just disgusting, and maybe if I hadn't warned him beforehand, I wouldn't have had to spend the last 3 months of my job just looking over my shoulder. I'll never know which choice was the right one, but I'm just glad I don't work there anymore. Some time ago I worked as a janitor in a building that was only accessible with a key fob. You'll need one to get in the front door, and you'll have to use it again to get into the offices. Now the shift was from about 4 p.m. to midnight, and if I finished early, I had to leave and was paid by midnight. Every evening I would spend time with my colleagues in the office until 5 p.m., and then we would all go to our respective buildings. I would first clean out all the bins, vacuum and mop where necessary, take care of any scheduled cleaning like steaming the curtains and such, and maybe go to the bathroom last, because usually everyone was not in the office at this time. Most nights I finished between 8 and 9 p.m., and there was a night when I finished and all I had to do was clean the bathrooms. I made it to the women's room with no problem, and then headed to the men's room, and when I entered, the light came on because of this sensor, and there was a man standing in the middle that I had never seen before, just standing there in the middle of the bathroom, dead still. He had his head down in a weird way, and I have no idea who he was or how long he was there, but he had to stand still long enough for the lights to go out, and then he had to stay still so they wouldn't turn back on. When I saw him, I just turned and walked away. It happened about 4 years ago at my then girlfriend's house, She lives in the state of North Carolina with neighbors on either side about half a mile away. Her parents and older brother were home at the time, and for context, we were both 15. It was around 11 p.m. on a Saturday, and a car pulled up in the driveway, and the headlights were shining into my girlfriend's bedroom window, and we heard a door. The car is closed. The girl and I thought it was a family friend or someone who had come to hang out and drink with her parents or something, and honestly didn't pay much attention to it. About 10 minutes later, my ex's father walks into the room, looking pretty mad. He tells us to close the windows and take the gun to be safe. We walk out the front door and sit with her mom and brother in the kitchen. Her father returns about 2 minutes later and goes into his bedroom, comes out with a gun, and goes out the front door again. To be honest, we had no idea what was going on, but soon we heard her father yelling, and then he comes back inside and says he's taken care of the situation. He told us that there was a car in the driveway with its headlights off and a man in the driver's seat. He said as he reached for the doorknob, but the man raised his head and backed out of the driveway. My brother and I always had nightmares, and we had a particularly scary dream about the house that I will never forget. So we rarely slept in our own rooms, which is normal for kids that age, and eventually it got to the point where we just slept next to Mom on the futon every night. We had aunts from our own rooms, and our parents also knew it and never questioned it. I know my brother and I weren't afraid to sleep alone. We were just afraid to sleep alone in this house. The whole property had a really creepy feeling to it, but we felt safe together. However, my father slept alone, in the very attic where his sister had encountered a demonic presence 20 years earlier. I know he remembers living in the house as a child, so I will never understand why he stayed in that room. Most nights he would also have these night terrors and scream so loud we could hear it down the hall and in the living room. I can see it scared my mom too, although she handled it well, and he screamed bloody murder until Mom went to the attic to wake him up, and it became commonplace, but it never became less terrifying. He really suffered from extreme insomnia in that house, was too scared to eventually fall asleep, or just couldn't sleep. And I remember my father looking like a zombie to me at that time, probably because he was restless and worked a lot too. As a child, he didn't take on all religion and never went to the church for help or anything. We talked to him later, but he admits that it was very exciting. His night terrors usually involved killing my brother, my mom, or me, and he didn't give me details most of the time and never felt comfortable talking about his terrors. And I could tell it scared him. My mom, who was an atheist even though she was raised Catholic, put the sandblaster in a creaky, leaky basement that had a staircase down from the kitchen and a basement door leading down there as well. The concrete staircase spiraled down and was quite steep. The basement itself was infested with mice, and I think we even found a feral cat with kittens in there. Honestly, it looked like an old damn torture chamber with terrible lighting and mold everywhere. My mother also spent countless hours in that basement, bringing designs into glassware and tiles to sell to help my father support us. She told me she always had a terrible feeling when she was alone and hated working in dim light. She would often open the cellar door to let in the light, but would hardly allow my brother or me to keep her company when she was working there. We moved in about 2004, and the family sold the entire riverfront property for about $1 million to some rich guy who wanted to rent out rooms to fishermen. Last I checked, it was sold or leased to some hippie who raises goats or something. I drove past her last week, and you can see through the giant glass windows that her rooms are lit up with red lanterns for some reason. My mom also developed sleep paralysis at that house, but she no longer visits. My parents divorced in 2014. She is now engaged to someone else and is also going to get happily married this March. My father's night terrors continued for years after we moved too, but they eventually stopped and his insomnia never went away, and he was restless until the day he passed away, which was last weekend at the age of 50. Now I've been having these routine nightmares, crazy lucid dreams, and just constant sleep paralysis since I was maybe 5 years old, even though I live far away from my family now. And in my own apartment, I've had some pretty creepy paranormal experiences with my boyfriend. My brother is now 23 and is taking care of my grandmother in the apartment where my father died, and I don't think he has the nightmares he used to have. We don't talk about it anymore because we're both just busy people. My cousin, Aunt Elle's daughter, recently told me that she also suffers from sleep paralysis and strange nightmares, even though she has never lived on a ranch. However, he thought there was someone else in the woods because of the car door we heard, so he went outside with a flashlight and a gun. When he came back, he told us to lock everything up and to all stay in one room. He said that he walked around the house and shined a flashlight into the forest, and there was a trail of reflectors that were taped to the trees leading from the road to their house, and he fired his gun several times to hopefully scare them off. Fortunately, nothing else happened, but it was a nerve-wracking experience nonetheless. But was someone planning to rob us? Kill us or something? We had no idea, but I'm glad we didn't have to find out. Apparently, we all sat up and slept in the living room that night, and I left the next day. I also forgot to mention that the reflectors were actually screwed into the wood, so that was definitely on purpose. Her father had left them overnight, but picked them up the next morning, and the whole situation was terribly strange. It happened when I was 17 years old, and I lived in a small rural village. I was at a friend's all evening just watching movies and relaxing, and went home around 11 p.m. It was quite a long walk back to my place, as she lived on the outskirts of the village down some lanes, and I felt relatively safe as it was quite quiet here when night fell. Honestly, you won't run into anyone, and there are hardly any cars on the roads, especially at this late hour, and it was surprisingly peaceful. But where I lived, there was also a large avenue with 2 large blocks of houses, like 2 large circles, which could be reached by walking down a small dark road, which consisted of several large old houses. So as I'm walking, I see this little beat-up Nissan Micra coming towards me, and the closer he gets, the more he slows down, and the guy almost breaks his neck trying to look at me. I mean, there was nothing subtle about it at all, and he almost stopped when he got close to me, and I started to panic. There wasn't a soul around, but me and this strange guy, and I was determined not to break into his tears, so I quickened my pace and refused to look at him, and as far as I knew, he was gone. I kept walking home, which was literally 5 minutes away in a straight line, and I kept listening for the car engine to start up and make sure the headlights weren't sneaking up behind me or something. I heard nothing and saw nothing, so I breathed a sigh of relief as I could see my home now. I went in and locked the door, and I saw my mom standing in the living room just chatting on the phone. I tried to interrupt the conversation by telling her about the strange guy in the red car. If for some reason, she goes to the front window and looks through the curtain, takes the phone from Maria and says, "What, this car?" This all happened a minute after I walked in the door, and I got to thinking, I don't think it can be him, because if he was following me, I would definitely see or hear his car. But before I have a chance to look for myself, there is a knock at the front door. I go over and answer it, opening it just a few inches, and there's this guy standing there, empty-handed, wearing a baseball cap. And it was definitely the same guy from the car, and I was just like, "What the hell?" I say, "Can I help you?" And he says, "Did you order a pizza?" And I say, "No, I think you have the wrong house." Taking a step towards him, he speaks again in a tone that he does not fuss with. "No," I said, "did you order pizza?" And before I can answer, my mom came from behind and opened the door and said, "Is there a problem?" This makes him mumble, "I have to get the address wrong," before he just gets in the car and takes off. Needless to say, we were both a little freaked out by this, and we made sure everything was locked down properly for the next few weeks. A few months ago, I answered an ad on Instagram for a girl who was new to town and needed someone to watch her dog while she went on a road trip. So I'm still very unhappy because my husband is going away for 8 weeks, and I don't want my son to grow up in a haunted house like me. I also really hate being home and being alone with our little guy. So somebody puts me in touch with a shaman, and he comes in and does his thing, and it was really cool to watch. He finishes and tells me what he found, and apparently there's a lot of shadow people, and they're hiding in the spaces upstairs, and at the top of the stairs and downstairs, and basically everywhere. I felt like I was being watched and stuff. Apparently for this guy, shadowy people feed on negative thoughts. Also, I never explained the specifics to him, so it was good that his conclusions matched my experience. The shadow people did not feed on me, but apparently on my husband. But I'm very sensitive, so I got all the bad vibes. The dog, as he said, is 80% gone, and if not, he will return. He said the barn was creepy and we should just burn it down and put a crystal net around the property to protect us from negative spirits in the future. I know this all may sound a little crazy, but honestly, I was desperate at this point. We also talked about some of my past experiences. I actually have quite a few, and we talked about the previous owner as well. I feel like her voodoo was actually being used to protect her from what we were potentially going through. The shaman was actually wonderful, and he gave me blue corn to store some crystals and also gave me some tips to keep my sensitivity. The shaman leaves, and the husband returns home, says that the house has become easier, and he cannot believe it. So fast forward a few months, and I'm watching Netflix with my little baby sleeping in my arms, and my husband comes in and says I saw something. Obviously, it was a bit vague, so I did a bit of research. Apparently, he thought one of our little Japanese guys had gone into the bathroom. Apparently, it was a white and small thing that went in there. Our chins are black and white, so he followed and the bathroom door closed. He is so confused about being a skeptic, so I messaged the shaman and he said he would do his thing and get back to me. Anyway, he gets back to us and says it's nothing to worry about. Sometimes I feel like things are moving around the house, but it's nothing like what we experienced in the beginning. No more shadows, no more phantom dogs, and I can actually go to the basement at night. I still don't like going there at night because it's still a bit creepy, but my husband isn't so skeptical anymore and he kind of understands now. But boy, has it been a wild ride since moving here over 2 years ago. At least everything is quiet in the house for now, but I hope it stays that way. When I was 9, I went to my friend Casey's birthday party. Casey lived near my grandparents and her family had horses and owned a barn that was about a 10-minute walk from my grandparents. My parents dropped me and my younger brother off at my grandparents'. He stayed there while I was at the party, and afterwards we both stayed the night at my grandparents'. I also remember that night very clearly. I remember being excited because it was the first party I went to without my parents. Casey's group is in the barn, and the horses are outside in a fenced area. There's music and decorations and balloons tied to just about everything, and tables of food and gifts and lots of other kids, but no one I know except Casey and her older sister. Since I didn't know anyone and Casey was too busy to spend much time with me, I felt left out, and after a short, awkward stand, I decided I was ready to leave. It's dark outside, and the country is far away, so there are no lights or anything else. I made it less than halfway to my grandparents before I got scared and turned to ask if anyone was coming with me. Mind you, I was only gone for a few minutes, but when I came back, things were completely different. There were no children, no decorations, no food, no music, just a dark, empty bar. Although they did visit a lot when we lived there, so I guess there's that. We're both in our 20s now and we don't talk much either. But we've always felt a stronger relationship than other cousins because we look almost the same and sound the same. It's 5 now. It is now 8 a.m., and I am telling this story because my Aunt Ella called me about an hour ago, and it was just out of the ordinary for her because she has a normal 9-to-5 job and therefore a normal sleep schedule. She's not working tomorrow, but it's still a little weird. Anyway, she called me to say she found her original crucifix that she was wearing when she almost lost it 30 years ago in that house. She gave it to her daughter and told her to wear it because Jesus is supposed to protect you from demonic presence, she said. And she also decided to give me her second crucifix, hoping that it would protect me from any unseen presence around me. Honestly, I'm gonna never take it off because she really wants me to have it too. Please understand that I know millions of people experience sleep paralysis and nightmares every day, and they are not demonic or spiritual. And even if they feel that way, scientists can somewhat logically explain why these things happen to us in our sleep with the help of science. However, I do not feel that my family's experience can be explained entirely in this way. I grew up without a God to pray to, and I've never been religious. In fact, doubting the existence of a higher power at all. I know it was quite a long story, but everything that I remember myself and was told by my Aunt Elia, my dad, my mom, my brother, and my grandmother is true. I didn't make any of this up, and I didn't intentionally exaggerate any details. Also, keep in mind that I was very young when I lived there, and I fully admit that it is possible that my young mind interpreted some of the events as scarier or different than they actually were. But my father's night terrors were really scary no matter what age I was. Strangely enough, I miss this house. I mean, I had my first memories there, with plenty of weird ones to help weigh out the scary ones. Anyway, I never thought I'd share this story here, but I just had to share it with someone, so I hope you enjoyed it. My wife and I live in a 2-story townhouse, and our bedroom is upstairs. To the left of the bedroom door is an old full-length mirror. The frame is made of oak, and the mirror was a gift to me over 20 years ago when a friend was cleaning his house. Our bed is in the middle of the room, and the mirror is just on the floor on my side. Now one of our dogs sleeps in bed with us. She has been near the mirror since birth, and has never had a problem with it. But in 2:40 this morning, I woke up to her growling and just looking in the mirror with her head and ears up. I reached over and tapped her bottom and just told her to stop, but she remained firm, but lowered her head a bit and continued to look straight into the mirror. After a minute, she started growling again, and then very slowly moved towards the mirror on her stomach, her grunts turning into barks. 1,000 things were going through my head at the time, like if it was an intruder or something worse. But the grunting and barking got louder and louder until she got up, got off the bed, and carefully walked over to the mirror, about 3 or 4 feet from him, and then put it down. D lying on his stomach, extending his front legs and pointing his head straight into the mirror. She remained in that position, growling, occasionally barking. I got out of bed and immediately turned on the light, and everything seemed fine. I noticed that the time is now 1 a.m., and she followed me downstairs, and she didn't want food or water or potty or even a treat. So in the end, we just went upstairs, and it was already 3:10. She watched me look in the mirror, and I tilted it and shook it and looked from her side, and there was nothing, and now she seemed fine. I didn't know her well, only that she was extremely spiritual and supported Akash's business practitioner or something. I'm still not entirely sure what that certificate or company name means, but we've since become friends, so it was a great dog-sitting gig. The dog was very intelligent and sweet, and her home, although small and a bit out in the countryside, was cozy and relaxing, complete with all the spiritual paraphernalia, crystals, sage sticks, candles, and such. And the backyard had a hammock and lights and crickets at night, and honestly, it was really peaceful and beautiful. The whole concert was supposed to be a good break for me, but I was wary because I knew that the girl was into many spiritual things, and deep down, I was worried about what kind of energy she might be letting into her space. And there was definitely something creepy about her, too. Like, for example, when we met at home to discuss the details, she suddenly looked up and took a deep breath. And when I looked up, I saw a hawk with open wings gliding beside us through the piney landscape. And it was a majestic sight. And as we stood in silence, it seemed as if we were meant to be there. Not in a romantic way, but in a kind of creepy way. It's like time stopped or something. Either way, the energy in her house seemed to come alive at night, and every time the evening came, I was overcome with a sense of dread. Obviously, I pushed those feelings out of my head and attributed the horrible feeling to the fact that there was no TV in the house. So maybe it was very quiet and I just wasn't used to it. I was there alone for a week and had to be with this dog, so there is no room to be scared, right? Well, toward the end of my stay, I was sitting on the couch one night and I felt something touch my right arm, just a slight nudge in the space between my shoulder and my elbow. I looked at my hand looking behind me and looked around the room for some logical explanation, and I told myself it must have just been a draft from the fan or something. Not at all, but then again, I didn't want to be scared and I didn't know what to think. I finished my beer and finally went to bed, and in the following weeks I told the story to my friends and several of my sisters, but I never mentioned it to the lady I was sitting for. I don't know why. I guess I just didn't want to hurt her or something. However, she ended up moving out of that house and back to her home state of Vermont, so I finally decided to reach out and give it a little lift. I asked her if she had ever experienced anything creepy in the house, and that was pretty much it. Also keep in mind, that I didn't tell her anything about what I experienced, and here is her answer. She told me yes, especially at night it was starting to feel really creepy, and sometimes I could feel a hand on my right shoulder. It used to scare me so much that I would run to sleep and hide under the covers. But then I started to see it as a hand guiding me through the darkness. After she told me this, I told her all about my experience of feeling something touch my right hand. And she said yes, I'm pretty sure it was the same, with a very strange and kind of gleeful giggle. Obviously, I never went back there, and after a while, I lost touch with that woman as well. So I turned off the light and went back under the covers, and she jumped on the bed in her usual spot and pointed at the mirror, and I was awake for about 20 minutes just listening to the sounds of the house at night, and the rest of the night was uneventful. But when I woke up this morning and went downstairs to get my coffee, I noticed that both laundry room doors were wide open, and I know for a fact that those doors were closed at 3 a.m. So first, let me set up some background to make the story flow smoother. It also happened almost 19 years ago, so I was almost 13 years old and was being raised by my grandparents. We lived in a tourist town in Florida. They had problems with their 2 daughters as adults, my mother being the older one, and they wanted to do everything they could to make sure I didn't end up the same way. A remake, if you will. Therefore, it must be said, they were very strict. My aunt was having a good period at the time. She kind of got her things together and we were all pretty close. My aunt also understood what it was like to be under a glass dome, metaphorically speaking. So since she was my only aunt, she made sure that the time we spent together was very cool. I would stay over on Saturday nights, and we would go and hang out at the pier, and she would let me hang out with my high school boyfriend, who would find ways to get wherever I was. Of course, my grandparents had no idea about any of these activities. I just spent time with my aunts and let them rest. It was actually nice to have a younger female figure since my mom wasn't around, and one night when we were out having fun, my aunt met this guy, and they hit it off really well. He was very nice and introduced himself to me. His name was JR, and he was kind of charming and a little talkative at first. But they exchanged numbers after hanging out for a while, and when we went home, we went to bed. They also ended up going more often, and my aunt really liked JR. He took her to his home, introduced her to his father, and showed her his land, while he himself lived in the forest in the desert. I've lived in this town for 30 years, and I still can't tell where it is. I was only there once, and he was teaching my aunt how to shoot a gun. I remember her shoulder jerking back from the shot, and it startled her, and he had this amazing flamenco outfit in his closet. It was all seemingly harmless, and I mean, everyone has their quirks, right? About 10 days later, maybe 2 weeks later, we were back on the pier by the payphones talking about what to do in the evening, what to have for dinner and whatnot. It was 30 between JR and my aunt, and as much as she loved me, I guess there were times when I kinda got in the way. Anyway, we're at the pier and he talks about how he has these painkillers. He offered me one, and of course I declined, and I told him I had a high pain tolerance anyway and I didn't need it. He then asks with a huge smile if he can see for himself, assuring me he won't hurt me. He's just trying to have fun. And this guy twists my arm behind my back until I hear it snap. I start to cry and he laughs and says, "Oh, honey, I was just playing. You said you have a high tolerance. I guess I was stronger than I thought. Sorry, but there's no need to spoil the good time we're all having." I walk into the private pier office that my grandpa was in charge of, clearly crying, and my aunt comes in and tells me that she also thinks it's very messed up and that she's been talking to him about it. She goes outside and he asks her what she's up to that night. She tells him she's not sure if I'll stay because of what just happened and all. I whined about going home and was honestly furious that she didn't judge him right then and there for hurting me. And well, he tells her that she should meet him under the bridge at sunset at 2 a.m. on the other side of town. He says that there are really beautiful stars and you can listen and hear fish. He tells her that he would like to see it with her and that they can dance under the moon and stuff. We all came from a fishing family and live in a fishing town, so fishing under the bridge late at night didn't necessarily raise a red flag or anything. When it's dark and late, there won't be people to catch all the fish. So she tells him maybe, and we leave. In the end, I decide to spend the night, sneaking in later, only if she takes my boyfriend Charlie, playing on the guilt. She calls when she gets home, even before we've agreed on Charlie, and says she can come, but I'll be with her. He groans and says, okay, I guess she can come too. Maybe she's tired and falls asleep in the car. About an hour after she called him, when I first asked her about Charlie, she agreed. She sits down with me, hugs me, and touches my face, lovingly asking for forgiveness what happened to my hand, and she calls him again and tells him not to worry. She takes Charlie away so that I can have my own entertainment, and they can have fun. But then he flies into a rage and starts sputtering and swearing that things are too complicated now, and he just wanted an intimate meeting with her, not a goddamn family reunion. He talked about not wanting to babysit the 13-year-old and her 14-year-old boyfriend and hung up on her, calling her crazy. She hangs up in surprise and tells him what happened. We spend our night with pizza rolls and a PlayStation, and we're fine. He calls her a few more times and stops by the house for a couple of weeks, but my aunt has had little to none of it. And after some time, he left our life as quickly as he came. But the whole affair only lasted a month, if that, maybe 3 weeks, I think, and overall, it wasn't the craziest experience she'd had with a man. But JR was soon forgotten, and we went about our business. Flash forward to 2 years later, and now I'm almost out of high school. My aunt moved to a city 40 miles away, and I still lived with my grandparents. They were still strict, but as they got older, so did I. In other words, I knew several ways to get around the rules. One day, my friend Frank and I were late for the bus from school, and we called our good school friend Darla to pick us up and drive us home after a little drive. She had a big, beautiful red truck, and I rode in its cab, loving the freedom of the wind. We smoked cigarettes, laughed, and just listened to the radio. The time I would spend on the bus to the bus stop was enough to heat up the tacos, and we drove a bit down the road before returning to Frank and I's place. We had a lot of fun that day, and she dropped me off first. My grandparents went outside and were very confused when they saw an unknown car, and even more so when they saw me get out of it, after letting her explain because she was older, cooler, and more responsible. My parents thanked her for the kindness of taking me home. They said how lucky I was that she just happened to be there to help me get home. What we do to our parents, eh? Anyway, that was the last time we saw my friend. She didn't show up to work for 5 days, and I can't speak for everyone, but I assume she just ran away or something. Darla's parents were going through a difficult divorce at the time, and Dad had a hot new girlfriend, and Mother was very bitter about it. I guess that's fair, but all the children were ashamed. Her truck didn't stay behind, though, and I figured she just got tired of her parents acting like babies and just drove off. I missed her, but she was in a whole other league of freedom and cool. 16 is a very different life to 14, especially when you go to different schools. And so I wished her well, and maybe even a little jealous that she left this city and I'm still here. I didn't hear from her for 2 weeks when my grandparents called to turn on the news around 9 in the evening, because apparently Darla's body was found in the woods. She was strangled to death and just left there for I don't even know how long. Obviously, I was devastated.